Back when I was a kid, Star Wars video games were among the best that were out there. Even before I had a console of my own, I was at friends' houses playing Battlefront, Jedi Academy, and The Force Unleashed. One of my favorite games of all time is Lego Star Wars. I mean, I'm pretty sure the only reason I'm such a big Star Wars fan is because of these games. To this day, every single time I see a Lego brick, I get PTSD of that Lego Yoda death sound. And sure, I was young and stupid, but now that I'm old and stupid, I can safely say they were fantastic games. Most of those games I remembered so fondly have generally favorable critical appeal, and other people I asked about it said they loved the games when they were kids too. They were a huge chunk of my childhood, and they cemented the thought that Star Wars not only meant great movies, not only meant cringy dialogue, but also meant great video games. But something changed 10 years ago. Since then, Star Wars games have been on the decline, barely relevant in the public eye. In fact, the only attention they've gotten in recent years has been because of how unbelievably bad they have been. Now, when people think Star Wars, they think of terrible microtransactions, greedy developers, and games that have no merit beyond the fact that they have a Star Wars logo slapped onto them. That is until a few months ago, when Star Wars began one of the most incredible comebacks that I've ever seen in the gaming industry. A redemption story in which the series literally went from one of the worst to one of the best in just a matter of days. An incredible occurrence that was only able to happen due to the culmination of dozens of things. If you had asked someone back in November whether or not Star Wars video games were good, they would have said no. Now, a game once thought to be dead is one of the most popular. A game nobody expected to be good might just be Game of the Year, and we might be getting a remastered version of the Lego Yoda death sound. This is the incredible, almost unbelievable story of the redemption of Star Wars video games. As with many stories like this, in order to look forward, we must first look back to truly understand what exactly happened. And trust me, it's a story you're gonna want to hear. To begin, let's go back to that golden age that I mentioned earlier. Now, the reason that Star Wars games were so great back then was partially because lots of attention was being drawn to the franchise due to the release of the prequel movies from 1999 to 2005. Say what you will about the quality, but people were certainly interested. And when people get interested, companies get interested. LucasArts, George Lucas's video game publishing and, at least at the time, video game production company, was in full force in the early 2000s, feeding off the popularity of the franchise at the time. Through a fruitful collaboration with BioWare, famous for games like Baldur's Gate, Mass Effect, Dragon Age, and even, ironically, Anthem, LucasArts was able to produce Star Wars: Knights of the Old Republic, also known as KOTOR, but now known as one of the greatest games of all time. In KOTOR, you play as a Jedi 4,000 years before the events of the original trilogy. Through decisions you make and characters you interact with, the game dynamically adapts, seeing whether you align better with the dark or the light side. The freedom that the game gave you was revolutionary, and the creative geniuses behind the game set it up for success. KOTOR launched with critical appeal in 2003 and would go on to sell more than 3 million units. Instantly, Star Wars was instated as a titan of the gaming world, and people associated Star Wars games with incredible lore, compelling storylines, rewarding gameplay, and a familiar and beloved world. It was set up for a life of success. And success followed. In 2004, LucasArts paired up with Pandemic Studios, a studio known for absolutely nothing besides the games I'm about to talk about. You see, together they produced the first Battlefront game, a series that would go on to be one of the most familiar in gaming. And I feel like while a relatively hardcore subset of gamers played KOTOR, a more casual group used to play Battlefront when I was a kid. To make a parallel to more current days, KOTOR is akin to Skyrim as Battlefront is akin to Battlefield, and even then, that's not really a fair comparison. But just because it was more casual didn't make it any less good. Battlefront received critical appeal and would go on to sell more than 4 million units, more than even KOTOR. And after seeing the success, LucasArts again paired up with Pandemic Studios to create a sequel in the following year. Battlefront 2 fixed a lot of the issues people had with its predecessor, improving single player drastically, fixing issues with the AI, and generally making the game the ultimate Star Wars battle experience. The game saw critical appeal and would go on to sell 6 million copies, cementing it as a classic. But now for my favorite of the earlier games, and amazingly a game that is more popular than all of the incredible games I just mentioned. A game that was paramount in introducing Star Wars to many kids back in the day, and a game that is very close to my heart. In 2005, the same year as Battlefront, LucasArts combined forces with a studio called Traveler's Tales to produce Lego Star Wars, the video game. It released just 2 months before Revenge of the Sith, the final prequel movie, and it was an immediate hit. Unlike the other games on this list, LEGO Star Wars was a game that people of all ages could enjoy. Parents, especially parents who were Star Wars fans, were comfortable giving the game to their kids because it was both rated E for everyone and because Legos are such an extremely well-known and respected brand of kids' toys. Teens and adults alike could enjoy the game because it was such a nostalgic and wholesome retelling of Star Wars films, and despite the fact that it was aimed mostly at kids, everybody was able to appreciate the surprisingly creative and clever game design. I personally have fond memories of my dad coming to help me and my brother out on the pod racing level, a level that haunts my nightmares to this day. So, by 2005, Star Wars video games were at their peak form. LucasArts was working in full swing to fund incredible games with amazing studios, and every big endeavor they pursued seemed to be golden. However, with the prequel trilogy finally finished, the outlook was a bit ominous. LucasArts wanted to continue this hot streak, but without films to boost sales and bring public attention to the Star Wars franchise, they knew things were going to be a bit bleak. In the following years, aside from LEGO Star Wars continuing to be so consistently incredible, seriously, I don't know how they made these games so goddamn good. I mean, aside from LEGO Star Wars games were flops. After 5 years of hitting nothing but home runs, nothing special seemed to be happening. That is, until 2008, when LucasArts published The Force Unleashed, a third-person action game that actually holds the title of the fastest-selling Star Wars game. However, with a pretty terrible sequel in 2010, LucasArts fumbled the ball and the outlook returned to being bleak, and ultimately they couldn't recover the franchise from its downward trajectory. But then, in 2011, LucasArts went for a Hail Mary, pouring tons of resources into one of its favorite studios, BioWare, to create an MMORPG successor to KOTOR known as Star Wars: The Old Republic. Possibly their most ambitious project yet, the gamble paid off. The game was received very well, with critics praising the sheer amount of available content in the game. For the first time in a while, things were truly starting to turn around for Star Wars video games. So, picture this. It's 2012 and things are finally looking up. People are regaining interest in the franchise for the first time in years, and everybody is looking forward to what's going to come next. So, if you're in charge of making decisions, what do? Well, if you're LucasArts, you take a gun, you put it to your temple, and you pull the f***ing trigger. When I die, play this at my funeral. Despite arguably sounding amazing on paper, I mean, using the Force with your hands sounds absolutely incredible to this day. Connect Star Wars rightfully received terrible Metacritic reviews, and people began to think of Star Wars games as a joke. For many people, the game is the worst Star Wars game ever made, and despite their best efforts, the following release of the extremely ambitious Angry Birds X Star Wars crossover only made the problem worse. Dejected and clearly losing sight of what had made their game so great, LucasArts needed something to change. And then, in October of 2012, Disney bought Lucasfilms for an incredible $4.05 billion. Change certainly followed. This could have been a breath of fresh air for the franchise, but instead, as one of their first actions with their new acquisition, Disney decided to sell the Star Wars game development license to one of the most hated companies in America, Electronic Arts. LucasArts went from being the powerhouse subsidiary of a coveted franchise to getting closed by Disney, and EA began to brainstorm how exactly they were going to squeeze every penny out of their new intellectual property. And to be fair, at first it didn't look too bad. EA has some great studios under its wing, and the news that they were going to assign the DICE and Visceral studios to their Star Wars games while keeping BioWare working on the Old Republic sounded pretty great. I mean, I made the loose comparison between Battlefield and Battlefront earlier on, and DICE, the developers of Battlefield, were going to be in charge of a new generation of Battlefronts. And this was exciting to me as a huge fan of both of the series. I was pumped to see what DICE would do with the IP. I mean, to me, Battlefield meant epic, gorgeous, engrossing battles, so in my head it was like a match made in heaven. I would love to see the developers at DICE put that same love and work into a Battlefront game. And on the other hand, Visceral had a pretty good track record with their flagship Dead Space series, and I guess they're kinda halfway there with the space stuff to begin with. I'm sure it'll go well for them. So, Visceral never really came to fruition, which is a bummer, but the Battlefront remakes certainly did, and as you can probably expect, I have a lot to say about it. The first reboot came back in 2015. Aesthetically, it was a masterpiece, but it checked every single box for me. The battles were huge, the graphics, as is typical for a DICE game, were absolutely gorgeous, the music was incredible and dynamic, and the sound design was surprisingly impeccable. I feel like I rarely truly appreciate things like gunshots, reloads, and footsteps, but DICE was so intentional with their sound design that these things really stood out. I mean, blasters in Star Wars sound dumb. It's part of their charm and appeal, but DICE managed to absolutely nail it, combining all the iconic Star Wars sounds into a neat package that translated to an incredibly sonically immersing game. But as you probably could have expected, the game had some serious flaws that kept it from being as great as it could be. Most notably, while the game was very aesthetically pleasing, it was also very thin. You couldn't dive any deeper. There were only a handful of multiplayer maps, the gameplay was very simple and very casual, and the single player was almost non-existent. Progression in this game felt unrewarding and pointless, and there wasn't a lot of incentive to keep playing. In addition, EA pushed the studio to appeal more to kids and casual players, grossly misunderstanding their target audience. I mean, when I think of Star Wars fans, I don't think of this, I think of this. It was close to being great, but it failed to deliver on all fronts. As a game, it was not really worth the price tag, and only hardcore fans of the series would keep playing this casual reboot. But the game sold very well, so naturally, EA decided it was worth another shot. Battlefront 2 released 2 years later, and it addressed a lot of the issues with the prior version. They added a campaign mode that is very okay, but unlike the previous, very existent, and added tons of content to improve the depth of multiplayer. However, they also added these. If you were alive back in 2017, you know about the backlash over the microtransactions in Battlefront 2. The microtransactions were not only in the form of random loot boxes, but they directly impacted how strong you were in-game. It was literally pay to win, and you had to pay a lot. It was absolutely disgusting, and it embodied EA at their worst. The backlash was so visceral that people began making memes about it. The Metacritic score for user reviews reached an impressive 0.8 out of 10, developers were getting death threats, and a historic comment went down as the single most downvoted comment in all of Reddit history. So EA was forced to take action, leading them to uncharacteristically remove all microtransactions from the game, albeit temporarily. And when they did add them back, they were purely cosmetic. As someone who stuck with the game, it actually did get a hell of a lot better. They revamped progression, making it so it actually rewarded you for playing, added tons of free content like new maps that coincide with the new movies, new characters, and new heroes, and genuinely have been pretty great to the game. But the damage had been done. To this day, if you ask someone about Battlefront, they'll quote the loot boxes and the microtransactions, and rarely will they know about the impressive turnaround that the game has gone through. However, in recent months, more and more people are becoming aware of the incredible transformation, but we'll get more into that later. In the years following the Battlefront 2 disaster, EA kept a low profile with their Star Wars games. That is, until this trailer dropped out of the blue in April of 2019.
Wasn't always like this.
Over 15 million people excitedly watched for a few reasons. One, the game was being developed by Respawn Entertainment, EA's new hit studio, known for making Apex Legends. And two, the game looked sick. It's basically Uncharted meets Dark Souls meets Star Wars, which is an absolutely godly combination. However, people, including me, were hesitant to get too invested, given EA's abysmal track record with the IP. But EA had a few more tricks up their sleeve when it came to the Fallen Order. They paired the game's release so it perfectly rode the hype train for both The Mandalorian and The Rise of Skywalker, making fans want to dig into any type of Star Wars media they could get their hands on. We saw this back in the Golden Age with the prequel films, and EA brought back that strategy expertly. When a Star Wars movie is going to be released, everyone gets in the Star Wars mood. Casual fans become hardcore, and hardcore fans become obsessed. And this rise was amplified by the unexpectedly great release of The Mandalorian on Disney+. Tons of fans wanted to dig back into the franchise and did so through the Fallen Order. And thanks to the developers at Respawn, the game was fantastic. It has a score of about 80 on Metacritic and was a welcome surprise to Star Wars fans. But the game, as great as it is story-based, meaning there is a set start and end. So when people finish the game still hungry for more, they would go to YouTube, look around to see what other Star Wars games are good, see that Battlefront has made a complete turnaround, and they would grab a copy of Battlefront 2 that conveniently was on sale for Black Friday, and they would dig in. And with all this great news, the perfect cherry on top came last week when EA announced that they would be releasing a new Lego Star Wars game in 2020 that encapsulated all 9 movies. And if I disappear after it releases, you'll know where to find me. I'll be with my boys in the cantina. So by saving Battlefront 2, by perfectly timing the release of their surprisingly good new installment to the franchise, and slating the release of a game that is almost guaranteed to be a hit, EA has finally proved that they're capable of handling the Star Wars IP. It's unexpected, and I still don't fully trust them, but EA certainly have the funds to make Star Wars games on the scale that the fans deserve. I just hope that they've learned their lesson and will continue to service their fans rather than prey on them. So Star Wars games, once among the most innovative and the most respected in the industry, fell from grace for a period of almost 10 years. But amazingly and absolutely unexpectedly, they're back in the spotlight once again. It was one hell of a roller coaster, but I am glad we're here. I just hope that we'll keep moving forward and forever stay away from games that are less like Star Wars and more like the fiery pits of hell. Thanks so much for watching, and thanks to my patrons RS, Ethan, Gamer of Gold, Dr. Keys, Admiral, Gem, Harmony, and Nicholas for making these videos possible. Now, if you're not new to the channel, you probably know that I usually have a camera in my videos, but because I was home for winter break, I was unable to bring it home, so if the quality is a little bit different, that's probably why, but I hope that the story was good nonetheless. To all of you that made it this far, thank you so much for your continued support. This has been Meraki, and until next time, bye-bye.
Like a star, you can't stop my shine. I'm loving Cloud City, my head's in the sky. I'm solo, I'm Han Solo, I'm Han Solo, I'm Han Solo, solo. Yeah, I'm feeling good tonight, finally feeling free and it feels so right. Oh, time to do the things